in cooperation with rural partners, the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs, and the Governor's Rural Affairs Council. My name is Mike Delaney, and I'm an Extension Community and Economic Development Educator based in Oakland County, up here in the Northern State Line region. Today's webinar is the first in a series of 3, which will address the challenges and opportunities attached to attracting rural residents. So if you won't mind, we'll begin with some quick housekeeping notes. So we, as I mentioned, will be recording today's webinar, and after the conclusion of today's presentation, registered participants will receive an email with materials from today's presentation and access for a limited time to the recording of the webinar. If you didn't register in advance for the webinar, that's okay. If you'd like to receive the materials, please put your email in the chat box to let us know, and we'll make sure you get a link to those materials. As always, you're welcome at any time to share your questions in the Zoom chat space by clicking on the chat icon at the lower center of the Zoom screen. We'll review the questions in a Q&A period following the presentation. Now, I'd like to start by welcoming our moderator for this webinar series, Dr. Norman Walser. Dr. Walser has been involved in rural development efforts for many years and is connected to basically all of today's collaborating partners. Dr. Walser, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Mike. Welcome, everyone. I'm really pleased that we're able to put together this set of webinars. There's been a lot of interest among rural partners as a member-driven organization to somehow find or get our members to come together and be able to work collaboratively on projects that would help rural areas prosper. And so this particular set of webinars, there's 3 of them that we put together to kind of follow each other. So there should be seen as sort of a unit, and a unit on recruiting the rural areas, recruiting residents to the rural areas. And so it's UFI Extension, Rural Partners, the Institute for Rural Affairs, Illinois Farm Bureau, Governor's Rural Affairs Council, and the Association of Rural and Small Schools in Illinois. And all of these groups have some sort of stake in promoting rural advancement and rural growth, basically. And so I'm Norm Walser. I'm retired when I can remember, but most of the time I work with the Institute for Rural Affairs and Rural Partners and the Governor's Rural Affairs Council on research projects and annual concerns. We do the annual conference, and recently we published a book on rural areas and transitions, meeting challenges and making opportunities. And I think the meeting challenges and making opportunities is really what this set of sessions is all about. We've had a change with COVID, with the telecommunication advances, the remote working possibilities, the growing importance of quality of life in residential decisions. All these things have opened new opportunities for more rural areas to retain and attract new residents. And community leaders now are placing more emphasis on recruiting residents along with recruiting employers. But as you're going to see today, there are a lot of things that are kind of misconceptions about rural. The idea that rural is declining, the idea that while we are losing some population, there are a lot of other things that are happening that somehow are sliding under the rug, and we need to kind of address them more recently or more carefully. The 2021 and 2022 annual conferences in February have had examples of places that have successfully attracted rural residents, and there'll be more examples on the upcoming conference in May 22nd to 23rd in Springfield. This particular webinar and the next 2 essentially are to help communities obtain advice or to obtain guidance from a mapping program, UFI Extension, Farm Bureau, other groups that really can be resources as you think about how do you try to attract residents over the future. Our speaker for these 3 webinars is Ben Winchester. He's a senior research fellow at the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Community Vitality. Ben is widely recognized for his work on brain gain in rural areas, successfully recruiting strategies and communities in Montana, Minnesota, other states. He's been a valued long-term colleague, and I'm delighted that he agreed to lead these sessions. So, Ben, if you want to take it away.
Right on. Thanks, Norm. Thanks, Mike. Really, it's exciting for me to be here today, everyone. I haven't really done a lot of work in Illinois. Norm's brought me there a couple times over the years to do some work with IIRA. But really, this is the first foray of kind of an official relationship here with Extension to kind of look at how do we talk about our rural places. And just so you know, my own background is in math and stats. I'm a data geek. I love data, but most people don't, and their eyes like gloss over when they look at tables of data. So hopefully everything you hear today will be consumable, understandable. Really, my own background, I went to the University of Minnesota Morris, which is you may know of the University of Minnesota, but we actually have 5 campuses across the state. And I went to school in Morris, which was in a town of 5,000 people. And I had grown up in a town of 25,000, which I thought was a small town at the time, like relative to Minneapolis, St. Paul, right? So I grew up in Winona. I was like, oh my God, I got to get out of here. But ultimately, I went to Morris, which was a small town. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is a small town, not Winona, right? And then I realized that it was so easy to get involved in small towns, make a difference. I was in the Red Cross, I was in the Eagles Club, and it was great. And then I realized 85% of all the cities in this country are smaller than Morris. Like part and parcel, like every time you hear of a small town that's got a radio station or a newspaper, there's like 25 other ones you've never heard of because they're not on the radar. So this is where I started, was in Morris. I wanted to do rural development work. But then I started to do economic analysis and gather economic data. And then one day there was a guy called Roger McCannon, who is the head of our continuing education unit at Morris. And he called me one day, and right after I graduated, he was like, hey, we're going to start this organization called the Center for Small Towns. We want you to be the first employee. And I was like, right on, because I was the bar manager at the Eagles at the time in a temporary position, which wasn't my career path, like bar manager at the Eagles, but I was helping them out, right? So meanwhile, I got on board with the Center for Small Towns. And this is when I first started traveling around the state, really realizing that I was hearing a narrative across our rural communities that did not match up with the narrative, the really terrible narrative that I tend to hear being told about us. I mean, so the premise behind all my work, and you'll see this here, I'm going to start to get to share here, is that the premise behind my work is that the narrative we're using to describe our small towns and rural places is terrible. And it's based upon things that may have happened in our communities 100 years ago, folks, 100 years ago. We're still talking about them today as if it's the nail in the coffin for why our town is where it is. So with that, I tend to talk kind of quick, so forgive me. We're going to record this. It'll make it available to you, but I've got lots of stuff to share, and this is just one of 3. This is step 1. And this is a framing device for me. So you'll see the subtitle here is Speak Softly and Carry Statistics. I've got data behind everything, research, data, articles, everything here has a citation behind it. If you want it, just shoot me an email. I'll send you a copy of the book or the article. So kind of taking a step back, I think during the pandemic, when that hit, there was a lot of attention focused on our rural communities. A lot of people called me saying, my gosh, isn't this going to save rural America? And I was like, well, we've already saved ourselves. And I think you'll realize that during the pandemic, our rural communities were in demand before the pandemic, so much so that when people started to look to our rural communities during the pandemic, they realized our homes were filled. I'm like, oh, so what happened during the pandemic? It just exacerbated our home values. So because the demand was already there. So this pandemic has really fueled a lot of interest in rural and turned more people's attention to it. But I am going to turn your attention to trends that have been happening for the past 40 years that have well worn this path of change across our rural communities. In fact, the community that we have today is very different than the communities we had before. So kind of stepping back, when I first was in Morris and I was like, I wanted to do rural development work. So I start reading books and journal articles, right? What do you find? You see things like this, like the decline of rural Minnesota, the slow agonizing death of this U.S. small town, survival of rural America, hollowing out the middle. Like all of these are terrible. And I kind of told my boss, like, man, the narrative around rural is terrible. You think we're all dying or, on drugs or, almost dead. Like, what am I going to be doing then? As a rural developer, if communities are all just dying, am I just going to help our small towns die? Like, is that a real job for a developer? Like, first we're going to get rid of your grocery store, and then we'll get rid of your hardware store, and then the gas stations, then we'll close up shop and send everybody out. That doesn't happen. But meanwhile, we do have a narrative that's based upon all of these things. So I'm going to pick on one here, and that's that hollowing out the middle book right here. And that is the rural brain drain. The rural brain drain, if you don't know, is when your high school graduates leave. And so it's a well-worn path of our young people. When they graduate from high school, they leave, and it's called the brain drain. This is not a uniquely rural trend. In fact, 18-year-olds of all generations in all decades have said they want to get out, right? And in fact, we have many households that are negative households that are like, hey, you need to get out to succeed, right? Which is okay. But at the same time, when you look at this book, what are the implications of this title right here? Hollowing out the middle is the title. And what is it based upon? It's based upon the rural brain drain. So this is the implication here, is that when we lose our 18-year-olds after graduation, if they leave, there's nobody left. We're hollowing out our towns. Like, they are the only people here to save us, right? I'm going to pick on this book a little bit because let the kids go is my answer. Let them go. But what they need to know is that they have somewhere to come back to. So meanwhile, we do have this narrative. We have a negative narrative. And here's part and parcel, a lot of things you tend to hear about. There's a brain drain. We lose our kids. True. We live in the middle of nowhere. That doesn't really sound good. We're a sleepy town, right? Or everyone knows one another. Nobody locks their doors. Like, all of these things are very common when you see a media narrative being driven. And mostly, right, the Kellogg Foundation will tell you this too. They did all these perceptions of rural studies. And whenever you see quotes like anybody that's interviewed everybody in town, that's a sign of a lazy reporter that's working upon stereotypes to define what that rural community is, right? You're a sleepy town till it was woken up by the blank, and fill in the blank with tornado. But the implication is this town doing nothing until something happens. Right? The lucky few escape. Our kids hear this, that you need to get out to be successful. And a lot of times when kids do return, and we'll talk about this, the kids that return are deemed failures. It's like, what are we doing here with this narrative? So meanwhile, a lot of times this narrative is based upon what we had, what we don't have, what we wish we had. Come approach guy to guy. Like, what do we have? Where are we? And what do we have? So let's look at where we're going. So I'm going to introduce the target as it was based on serious research. But I get fired. I tell my kids this all the time. I would get fired immediately if I started proclaiming things that weren't true, right? So again, everything methodology. So meanwhile, some changes occur to and in our rural communities. The early 1900s, the mechanization of agriculture alone reduced the number of farm workers by 20, and some places up to 60%. So right, the early 1900s, the rural population's going down. You mechanize agriculture, you don't need all 6 kids. You can't have a job for all 6 kids on the farm anymore. 4 of them are going to the city now. So that is something that happens. And almost at the exact same time that we mechanize agriculture, roads and transportation systems are put into place. Excuse me. And I'm not talking about the interstate highway system. Like the interstate highways, those didn't even get put in place until the late 50s, early 60s. I'm talking about the very first roads. And I used to think 100 years ago was like can't even fathom that kind of time ago. Okay. But now it's like, oh, just 100 years ago, we introduced cars. And we went from having no cars to cars. We literally went from Little House on the Prairie to not Little House on the Prairie in 10 years. You went from horse and wagon, where if you're in Walnut Grove, you got to get to the doctor in Mankato. It takes you 2 days to get there, right? And now you're there, you spend another 3-4 days there. Your one doctor's trip turned into a 7-day, week-long trip to Mankato. Now you've got cars, you're to Mankato and back in a day, maybe half a day, right? So this transformed not just how our town saw each other, but the relationship we had with each other, themselves, but how we connect with each other. So now we have this interrelationship that gets developed during this time that leads to the rise of all these regional centers. And we start to see the economy shift. And so at the same time, and this is the pre-1950 period, that we had the GI Bill. And GI Bill afforded an opportunity for rural residents, mostly males, right, for the first time ever almost in these families, to get a college degree. And so this kind of educational level started to grow in our rural communities, but in the midst of all these people who historically had not gotten very far in their educational achievement. And then from 1950 and on, we started to restructure our main streets. And this is a really kind economist way of saying businesses closed. Hardware stores, grocery stores, apothecaries, right? You have this. I lived in Hancock, Minnesota for a long time, and I know there's people from Hancock County here, so hello. But I lived in the small town of Hancock, Minnesota, population 700. And 1 week after I moved in, I walked into the grocery store and there was one loaf of bread on there. And I asked the manager, like, hey, what's going on? And she says, oh, we're closing up. And I was like, oh, it's really easy. It is really easy to think that when you close your grocery store, your small town's going to die. Like any of these things, you close your hardware store, now people are going to be leaving town, our small town's going to die. You look at all the news articles about how these changes are described, and there's a continual straight line equation that if we lose our blank, our small town is going to die. Show me all the dead towns. Our landscape should be littered with dead towns at this point, right? We're not dead. We're still here, but the buildings may be empty, right? So here's like this picture here is Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. This is like the Norman Rockwell-ish view of what I think people expect to see when they go to a small town, like full Main Street. There's cars everywhere and there's people walking around. Oh, that's not what Hancock looks like today at 2 p.m. A majority of the people are commuting out. Right? Our main streets have a boarded up, literally a boarded up grocery store, a boarded up bank building, so a lot of times these visuals make you again reaffirm your notion that our small towns are dying when in fact we have transitioned a majority of these jobs to regional centers. We live these regional lives, right? Part and parcel of a rural life is travel. And so that again, if you're an employer that's got people who can't afford to fix their car, like maybe we should try to fix their car because transportation is just an inherent part of our rural communities today. So with that, I just want to suffice to say that we've had a lot of transitions and our main streets don't look like this anymore. They look different. And just because they look different doesn't mean they're dead necessarily. At the same time, when I started to do my work in rural development, it was during the time of school consolidations in the 80s and 90s. And again, a lot of hand wringing, just like with the grocery stores, people saying, oh, I should have shopped here more locally. Well, that's not going to save you, right? Actually, the trends that happen around globalization, around Main Street restructuring, there's almost nothing you can do locally to help prevent this. And why is that? It's because these trends that are occurring that cause you to close these grocery stores are happening everywhere. It's called globalization. It is impacting all of our small towns. When we close a grocery store in your town, it's not your fault, right? There's like dozens that close in Chicago, but you don't hear about them because you got alternatives within walking distance. But you close a grocery store in your small town, it's probably your only one, right? And now you have to drive to get to the grocery store somewhere else. You have to look at this empty building every time you drive down Main Street. So the visuals can be very overwhelming in terms of what we believe we see in our small towns. And so now to follow up on that, it's the school consolidation too in the 80s and 90s. It went from like, we had a full K-12 school in my town and a full K-12 school in Molly's town, but now we're consolidating. Right. So now I'm going to get the K through 6 or K through 9 or something. And you're going to get the high school. So we kind of did this balancing act, or sometimes we close all our schools and you put up a school in the middle of the countryside, which we did all across this country too. And now so this was when I started to do my work, because you had a lot of hand wringing over this. And the number one audience that really didn't care about all these consolidations were the kids. They were the most resilient through all this. But meanwhile, the parents are like, what are we going to do? Our owl name is gone. Now we're the Hawks? Like, what does that mean? Like, oh my God. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous and parochial, but it's true. We have gone through these transitions, but on the school consolidation side, that actually is something you have control over. Because the number one driver of school consolidation is not open enrollment, taking kids out or anything like that. It's the birth rate. And when the birth rate goes down, it's hard to welcome in kindergarten. This is when nobody's having kids here, or if people are having fewer kids. But this is something you have control over. You can start having pro-fertility days in your small towns and start to bump up your kindergarten enrollments, right? I mean, tongue in cheek and all this, but really it's like, how do we talk about this over things that we have control over versus things that we don't have control over? So now very commonly you hear about hospital closings. These are real things, right? All of these things are real that happen to our towns, and they currently drive our narrative, are things that happened 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago. So meanwhile, I like the Mark Twain quote that rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Like, show me all the dead towns. Man, we should have towns everywhere. But rural is changing. It's not dying. And I just want to say this. How did we arrive at this point at which we have such a negative narrative on one hand? You would think we're all dying, there's nobody left. But on the other hand, I can't find a home to buy. I can't find a home to buy across this country in our small towns and rural places. Like that doesn't, like if that doesn't make any sense to you, it shouldn't, because we are not dying. Our homes are filled. We have been filled since the 90s. We're going to start going through all this. We are not dying. We're far from dead. In fact, we're more vibrant and durable than ever. So a lot of times I believe we don't have what we need to fight this negative narrative, especially when you've got a media that doesn't really cover us in ways that we believe truly reflects who we are. So for example, here's a slide of, sorry, let me close this here. One of the major newspapers in Minnesota, during this time that we are threatening to close all our post offices, like one of our major newspapers sent a reporter up to the small town of Calumet, up in the corner there in the top left. Like they sent a reporter into the small town and asked people like, hey, what's it going to be like if you close your post office? Sorry. And of course, like the reporters got tons of quotes to draw from. I mean, people love talking to reporters. So there's all these things that they could choose from, right? So now let's look at what ended up in the newspaper. In the corner here, it says Iron Range town fighting for more than the mail. That sounds okay, right? Calumet challenges the decision to close its post office, which is a social hub for its residents. And I was like, social hub? Like I never hung out in the post office in Hancock. Like I knew the people that worked there and stuff, but like it wasn't a stop shop. And this is kind of funny until you think of how many people just read this. How we just had 750,000 people in the Twin Cities metro area now believe that the people in the small town of Calumet hang out in their post office. This is narrative writing. This is narrative driving. This is inhibit people from, I mean, it's a joke. This turns rural into a joke, right? So now how do we counter this? I don't believe we have a good counter because there is no national rural media for this. So I'm here to give you ammo, right? My last name is Winchester. So I'm going to give you ammo to fight this negative narrative because it's terrible. So meanwhile, as a part of this, I did a media study for the Kellogg Foundation, or sorry, not for the Kellogg, for the McKnight Foundation here in Minnesota. They wanted to better understand how did the metropolitan media portray rural, which was interesting in itself. And I'm not going to get into depth in that report. But one of the things I did as a part of this, so I would talk to all these reporters and I would be like, hey, what time of day did you go to Clontarf for Ely or Hancock or whatever it was? And the average time of day that the reporters got out was between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Well, if you go into Hancock between 10 and 2, everybody's gone. They're all working, right? And meanwhile, you drive down Main Street, it's boarded up bank building, boarded up grocery store. And like, it reaffirms in the stereotypical reporter mind that the small town is dying. There's nobody here. Oh yeah, there's all the boarded up buildings. So what do? You go to the cafe. Who do you find in the cafe? All the retired folks who talk about how life used to be. And I'm not making fun of them. I'm just saying that that's one narrative in town that's now driving and reifying a narrative from our past. Now, we do have a new narrative, and it's this. Since 1970, the rural population hasn't gone down, it's gone up. It's gone up by 11%. What's gone down is the relative percentage of Americans that live in small towns and rural places. So in 1970 over here, in 1970, 1 in 4 people live in rural places. Oh, I can't get my finger over there. It's that one right there. 1 in 4 people live in small towns and rural places. But by 2020, it's to 1 in 8, right? 14%, somewhere in there. 14% of people live in rural places. Well, how can that be? How can that percentage go down when the rural population went up, right? The pie got bigger. The pie of people, right? The whole country, the population got bigger, and the rural part got bigger, but it didn't get as big as fast as urban areas did. The urban growth rate is 11%. The rural growth rate, the rural growth rate is 11%. The urban growth rate is 48%. So now you see a relative percentage decline in people living in rural places. But does that mean people prefer rural living? Nope. But that's always the headline you see. People prefer rural living. It's obvious because a fewer percentage of Americans live in rural places. It's obvious they're dying. I hope this makes sense for you, the fact that you can have our population go up and not up as fast, which results in negative overall decline. At the same time, many of our populations have grown in our rural communities to such an extent they become urbanized. Okay, so this is important, people. Over the past, since 1974, 25% of all the counties in this country have been reclassified from rural to urban. And how is that? It's because when you look at the map, all the counties in gray on this map are counties that were metropolitan in 1974. All the ones that are yellow or orange here are the counties that shifted from rural to urban. So what happens then, right? And you see this, it's called the concentric ring growth around every urban area sees this, right? And my point here is, all right, so let's imagine you're core Chicago or core Minneapolis, St. Paul, right, in the early 1900s, and then you don't want to live in the urban area anymore. So what did you do? You created the first ring suburbs. People moved out to the first ring suburbs. It's all the suburbs were created. It's not that people wanted more city life, it's that they didn't. And then they moved out to all these small towns and rural places, and then so many people moved out to the first ring suburbs, they become urbanized, right? And then now the ones in orange here are the ones that since 1974, the people in the core urban area were like, I don't want to live here anymore. And then they look out to the first ring suburbs and they're like, oh, that's just more urbanity. I don't want to be here. And then they move out to the second ring. And you've seen this, folks. So these rings keep growing around every one of these metropolitan areas. So that's where, again, what happens then to my data? I'm going to call it my rural data, my rural population data. It looks like it's in decline because what happened? You just took a county away from me and put it in the urban category. And so like Blue Earth County, Minnesota is the latest one in Minnesota. We shifted from rural to urban status. But what happens here then? The rural population just went down by 80,000. It didn't. It got taken away from us. So again, the rural population went up by 11%. Given that 95% of all the urban growth that happened in this country happened in rural places. You're welcome, urbanity, for your growth. It's that so many people wanted to live in rural places and small towns, you urbanized all these places. Rural and less dense environments have been a regular preference for our population. But most of the time, we just look at total population. It's did our population go up or go down? Because if it goes up, we're growing and we're winning. And if it goes down, we're losing. And I call this the Ricky Bobby approach to population growth. So if you don't know, Ricky Bobby, there's a movie called Talladega Nights where Ricky Bobby was a race car driver. And his dad told him when he was younger that if you ate first, you're last. And his dad later told him, like, that was stupid. I should have never said that. It doesn't make any sense, right? Or whatever. But meanwhile, he kind of lived this theme. And that's the way we go with our populations too. We believe that we're not growing, we're dying, right? So let's look at the map, and all the counties in white are the counties that experience population losses. Losers, right? And these are all the big loser counties. Well, let's talk about why you're not losers. Okay, this is all tongue-in-cheek, right? So I want to talk about, first and foremost, why you should never use your population as an indicator for your success and failure. And why is that? It's because our population doesn't tell us anything, and here's why. So from 1960 to 2010, here's a 5-county area in western Minnesota, rural counties, like, I mean, not small rural, we got one that's got 5,200 people. But if you look at their population from 1960 in this whole region, the population went from 69,000 to 45,000, a loss of 35%, right? That falls right in line with negative narrative, the big losers, like, of course, you're a rural place, losing people, right? But at the same time, why don't you look at the line below that? The number of households went up by 3%. Right there. How can that be? How can you have your population just pummel down, but your households go up? Average household size has gone down. The average household size in this country has gone down a full person since 1940. So, right, if you have 100 houses in your town, in 1940, you're going to have 360 people, right? 100 houses times 3.6 people. But today, because of declining birth rates, because of different household structures that we've got, the idealism over nuclear households, all this stuff, which you'll hear way more about in the housing webinar, which is the third webinar in this series. But for now, we're just going to stop here and say that the average household size has declined a full person, 3.6. So 1940, your 100 homes would be home to 360 people. But if you have those same 100 homes today, you're just going to have 260 people. And that's not because people are all moving out. It's because the composition of the people inside our homes has gotten smaller, right? And you don't have fractional people, you know what I mean? But I mean, ultimately, like the households with kids have fewer kids. We have way more and more single and two-person households in our rural communities. So really, my point here is you are going to lose 29% of your population by doing nothing except existing in the modern world. So if you've lost less than 29% or done better than losing 29%, you're doing pretty good. Like, I mean, because this is demographic destiny is losing people. Now, today, we have a very common situation in our rural communities where you have two senior spouses and one of them passes away and the surviving spouse stays in that house. So then just imagine this, what happens to your sign outside of town that's got your population on it? It's your population just trickle went down by one because somebody passed away, but your occupied households stayed the same. 30% of your rural households today are owned by people over the age of 70. 30%. Another 45% are baby boomers. There is so much change coming to our rural communities. It's almost unbelievable over the next 25 years. So we're not even going to get into that today. We're going to talk about who is moving in. But I know, I got one more thing. So as an example here, again, we have this narrative that's driven by population change, right? And here's this column of population change. And here, right, Calhoun County lost 7% of your population. You're a big loser, just like before, right? But wait a minute, your housing units actually went up by 2%. Is that a loser? Maybe not. Maybe we should more closely examine the composition of our housing units rather than using total population as an indicator for success and failure. So, right, according to the population change, y'all are huge losers in this state, right? Well, Cass County, 11% population loss. Gallatin, 14%, 12%, 10%, Marshall. I mean, but again, it doesn't always match up with housing units, which tend to be extremely stable across our rural communities. Now, you'll see here, I don't have 2020 data, and for good reason. I don't trust it. There is something wrong with the 2020 housing unit numbers. And I'm just going to stop with that. If you're a data geek and wants to know more and have a conversation about that, I convene multiple state auditors and demographic experts to try to figure this out, and nobody has a good answer. So there's a reason why I'm not using 2020 yet. I'm just not happy with where it's at. But meanwhile, across Illinois, from 2010 to 2019, 91% of your counties lost population, like loser, right? That's a loser narrative. But 71% of the counties gained housing units, not loser, stable. But again, that narrative, even stability is called stagnancy, right? It's like we can't even win for being stable. So again, watch the language we use, even when we're talking about stability, is turned as something else. So meanwhile, one of the data points I ran across early on in my career was the number of people moving all the time. And every 5 years across this country, about 49% of households are moving. In Illinois, it was 46% move every 5 years of household or residents move every 5 years. So I wanted to better understand who's moving in and who's moving out. So this was one of the first charts I made. And this is Grant County, Minnesota, a rural county. And on the left side here, if the bars go to the left, that means there's people moving out in those age ranges. And if the bars go to the right, it means there's people moving in. And when I first made this chart, I was like, oh yeah, here's the brain drain, right? That Grant County lost 43% of its young people. They're big losers, like that common narrative, whatever. But then I was like, wait a minute, you got 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds all moving in here, and you got 10 to 14-year-olds, and they're not moving in by themselves. They're coming with their parents above there, right? And I was like, what is this? Who's writing about this? What is this huge growth of people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s? And what do I find? Almost nothing, just anecdotal articles. I mean, Economic Research Service did some things in the 70s about rural renaissance a little bit. And like, apparently there's growth in the prime earning years cohort. And like, apparently, like, isn't this great news? Meanwhile, we have books and journal articles. Like I've got colleagues in my industry that all they focus on is this. Like, what can we do to keep our kids? Like, you want to raise more resentment in your 18-year-olds? Tell them they can't leave town, right? Like, no, you're not leaving. We got to keep you here. We don't want this brain drain. Like, okay. So meanwhile, we have people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I called my colleague, Randy Cantrell in Nebraska, and I was like, hey, Randy, I think we got a brain game going on. There's people even in the panhandle of Nebraska, like literally 98% of counties across this country saw gains in 30 to 49-year-olds. This has been a regular trend for our rural communities. So meanwhile, I was like, Randy, we got to study these folks. As academics, study means like we're going to do focus groups and surveys and interviews. And so we found all these people in the Panhandle and Minnesota, Panhandle, Nebraska, and Minnesota. And we asked newcomers, why did you move to your small towns? And the top 3 reasons were, number 1 was a simpler pace of life. getting away from a commute, access to nature, recreational things, right? The second top reason was for safety and security, especially high with people with kids. And the third top reason was the low cost of housing. Nowhere in the top 10 in Minnesota was a job. Our sorry, all you economic developers who are on this call right now, this may be new to you, but there are consistently people moving to your towns without jobs, having jobs locally. What does this look like? This gets real messy, which is why we're going to go into that in session 2 around resident recruitment. But meanwhile, we did these surveys. We found all these new people. We asked them why they move here, what they do, who they are. And so just 41% of new resident households said they moved to the community because they had a job or a job offer. So less than half now. That number was just over half 20 years ago when we started this doing these newcomer surveys, but now we're under half. And for the older people, like they don't need to move for a job. I mean, just a third of the older people say that they move because they had a job or a job offer, but younger, you're more invested in advancing your career. So you're making choices around that. So that aside, we also found, and this turns a lot of stuff on its head. I hope you have an open mind for all this. What we found is 3/4 of newcomer households are not from your town. A lot of times we see like, oh, Mike's son moved back to town here, right? And they're easy to see. People who move back, i.e. returnees, are easier to see. It's like, oh, there's Mike's son, and he moved back. It's great to see him here. But for every time there's a person that you may recognize or have a family name, there's 3 other households you don't recognize or have a family name that are moving in. And how welcomed are they? What type of experience do they have? Like if somebody moves back that's a returnee, they've got access to social networks and all these really great things. And they also like struggle in many ways because they've got a familial name, right? And it's like, oh, hey Ben, I know you moved back. God, I remember when you broke those windows in 4th grade. That was so funny. It's like, I'm 52. Like, I don't even remember that hardly. Like, that's not who I define my life by. What are you even talking about? So like, you've got your own kind of familial baggage, right? I call it that for the returnees. But the other 3/4 of households are transplants. They're picking up and moving from somewhere else and choosing to move to your town. So what type of experience do they have? Now, 91% of college or bachelor's, 75% of household incomes over 50,000. And the one I want to hit on here is 47% have kids in their household. Just 47% or just under half of newcomer households have kids. So the newcomer households actually are easier to see, the ones with kids, because it's like, oh, there's a new kid in my kid's class and there's their parent right there. It's like, oh, there they are. But every time there's a newcomer household with kids, there's going to be another one you tend not to see. And if they tend to look like everybody in town, you don't even know they're there. Like, I mean, I comically say that, especially during the winter, it's hard to even see new people moving in. Like you could have somebody new move in across the street, but you wouldn't know it because it's dark when you get up in the morning and dark when you get home at night. And you don't even see kind of changes that are happening right around you. So you could be pumping gas next to your new neighbor down the street and you wouldn't even know it because we just don't have opportunities for social engagement like we used to in the past. So with that, 14% of newcomer household respondents telecommuted, but I think I've got a slide later on here that shows overall with their spouses and partners included in this too. A full 20% of newcomer households are telecommuting in some way. And these are data points a year before the pandemic. We had 20% telecommuting. So now we expect those numbers to be even higher. So we look at Montana replicated this newcomer survey a year into the pandemic now. So we did ours. So Minnesota here is a year before the pandemic. Montana is a year into the pandemic. And the one I want to hit on here is this: lived in the community before, went up from 1 in 4 households to 1 in 3. And we kind of found out why. We found out by interviewing home sale, doing real estate agents and assessors to talk about the people moving into our rural communities during the pandemic had access to a social housing supply, meaning they knew about a home that was put on the market. 40 to 60% of home sales during the pandemic were not arm's length transactions. When they say that, I mean arm's length is when Norm is selling his house and he put it up on Realtor and I'm some stranger that's looking in from the outside and I'm going to put an offer in on that home. 40 to 60% of home sales during the pandemic were not like that. It was, hey, Norm, I know your mom is looking at moving out of her house. We're going to take you out to supper tomorrow and we're going to just get this done. There's no agent involved. And so, or sometimes you have corporations buying units too for their employees. We have all these different ways that homes are getting moved outside of the traditional way you look. So in fact, I work with National Rural Education Association. I know Dave's here too, is that there's a website to help school related staff and faculty find a new job. Well, let's go look for a job in Illinois. And then I find a job in one of the small towns, and then I go to realtor.com and I can't find a home to buy. Well, move on to the next job. I mean, literally, when you don't have access to a housing supply, you can't welcome in new labor, right? So my point is, we don't have a workforce housing supply, that we don't even have a labor shortage. We have plenty of labor. We just don't have the right kind of housing. And currently our seniors are in these family homes longer than ever before. I'm not even going to get into this right now. That's webinar number 3. So meanwhile, at the same time that all these people are moving in to our rural communities, whenever I presented this early on in my career, I would get local leaders saying, well, where are all these new people? They're not part of my groups. And I say, oh, you're right. They're not part of your groups. They're part of theirs. And you're not part of theirs. We have to be real careful about how you badmouth or talk about the younger generation. In fact, we see this very consistently, right? If you talk about the entitled, whatever, young people, it raises the hair on the back of my neck. We cannot continue to use this kind of negative language. So meanwhile, when we look at who is involved in our small towns and rural places, the National Center for Charitable Statistics has a really great database. I know you don't know what a great database is, but for a data person, like, it was great because it gives me the number of nonprofits in each county. It gives me the names of all the nonprofits, gives me their assets, their revenues. So what happened was, when I first got the feedback that social life was dying, I get this National Center for Charitable Statistics data, and I find out the first time I looked at the data was just these 2 data points. I was like, oh my gosh, the number of nonprofits in Illinois, similar to Minnesota, goes up by 10 to 15% every 5 years. That's not the story of social life dying, is when the number of nonprofits go up and go up. But what happened is, from 2010 to 2020, so when you look at this data from 2010 to 2020, I don't know if you remember, but in 2011, the IRS, so basically 2011, the IRS looked at this list of all the nonprofits and they were like, you know what? I don't think this list is accurate. I think that list includes a bunch of nonprofits that are dead or died out 20 years ago. They don't really know, and they don't really keep track. So they sent out a postcard to every nonprofit and they said, all you have to do to prove you exist is return the pre-postage paid postcard. Well, when we look at the data, there were a number that did not return their postcard. And it was 21,000 nonprofits in Illinois did not return that postcard and got removed from the database. But again, if you're back on this data, it looks like it was a decline in the number of nonprofits. But we know there was a great cleanse that happened from 2010 to 2020. We cleaned up the data, and this is a more accurate picture of the nonprofits in the state. But when you add the numbers that were taken out in, you see that growth line, right? It's still growing. Nonprofits still have a growth rate of 10 to 15% every 5 years. Social life is not dying. It just looks different. When we look at the composition of the nonprofit sector across Illinois, we see that the number one, so NTEE is a way to classify nonprofits. You can be a church, right? Religion related. Number one in just about every state in this country, right? Top thing, churches, right? But number 2, educational institutions are the most popular nonprofits across the state. Then philanthropy, community improvement. When we look at just the number of nonprofits that have been created in the past 30 years, more than half of all the nonprofits in the state have been created in the past 30 years. And what types of nonprofits are they? Education institution related activities. So this could be like kids' sports activities. It could be booster clubs. It could be more formal organizations. Number 2 is philanthropy, volunteerism, grant making, and then recreation, sports, leisure. My point here is not what all these groups are. My point is we continually create groups to reflect what we want to do. If I don't want to be in the Eagles Club anymore, I'm creating a bicycle association. So this is like the big shift I want to get across here today. And that is, we have to be careful about this narrative, telling these young people that they're selfish or don't want to be involved. This is what we do every decade. This is what we do to every generation. Tell them they're selfish and entitled. Y'all baby boomers that were called selfish and entitled too. And now we're doing the same thing to our kids. It's brutal, folks. We cannot continue to do this. So be careful about how we talk about these young people, because if there's anything in common here, it's that 18-year-olds are selfish. And rightfully so. You're trying to find out who you are as a person and what kind of career you want or who you're going to meet. And like, right, instead of saying like, oh, these kids don't care about the community, like, yeah, you're right. They're worried about themselves. And I'm okay with that. So be careful about how we talk about the young people and the choices they make, because the biggest shift we have seen in how people get engaged across our rural communities is this. Historically, people would be involved in place-based groups with a broad focus, like the Hancock Community Betterment Club. But today, people want to be involved in just the opposite on both poles. So instead of a narrow geography, it's a wide geography. Instead of a wide focus, it's a narrow focus. So we go from Hancock Community Betterment Club, only serving Hancock, but helping the firemen or the church or do whatever, broad focus, to today, people in the West Central Minnesota Snowmobile Association. It's 14 counties big. They don't do everything. They snowmobile. Like it's their number one kind of organizing characteristic. So this is the biggest shift. If you don't recognize where people are engaged and involved, you're going to miss them. So there's tons of opportunities here. As community developers, all you community developers on the call, this is your potential for bridging. Bridge your place-based groups with your interest-based groups to help both succeed as we move forward. So then I would get this question all the time. I would add, I'd be like, hey, Mike, are you interested in moving to a rural place? And the number one answer when I ask urban people about moving to a rural place, like, hey, could you move to like Hancock? And the number one answer I get is, well, I'm not a farmer. It's like, well, actually, we're more diverse economically than ever before. So we did these studies at Minnesota Extension that says, you're right, no one rural community is diverse, right? But same with like, many of the suburbs we have in our urban areas, but that aside, right? So Hancock, right? Hancock doesn't have a diverse economy. What we found is when you put 3 to 5 rural counties together, you end up with the same diversity of occupations and industries that you find in an urban area. So our answer is you can be a blank in rural America and fill in that blank with whatever. But if Norm shows up in my community and says, I'm an electrical engineer, I'll be like, oh, sorry, we don't have any jobs in Hancock. If I'm real parochial, I am there. But if I'm recognizing the region and the way we live, I'll be like, but we have electrical engineer jobs in Benson, 12 miles to the south. But I have to know about those things. I have to know about the region that we live in and the opportunities that exist within that. So just as an example, we'll go into this more on our resident recruitment webinar next, but like, for example, in Hardin County, every day in Hardin County, 317 people commute in to work in the county. Every day, 858 people commute out. And so just 339 people both live and work in the county. Just like, it's like, was it 60, like 50% or 28% both live and work, the 339 plus 858, just 28% of people that live in Hardin County work there. I'll just say this. Our county boundaries were drawn during a time of horse and buggy. They do not reflect any delineation of how we actually live. But meanwhile, we've got to make decisions in that. So the decision here is, how do you do economic development work when people don't live and work in the same place? Across Minnesota, just half of Minnesota residents work in the county that they live in. And that number is continually sliding down. So I'm going to call this brain game. There's people in their 30s, 40s moving in. They're bringing their mid-career. They've got spouse, partner, family, career prospects, like all of these things. I'm going to call it a brain game. Instead of dragging down our negative narrative with this brain drain language, oh, I'm losing our 16 to 18-year-olds, I'm going to talk about what a great asset we've got. And at the same time, when I first did this study, people were like, oh, in 2002, they're like, oh, this is new. It's like, oh, actually, if you look back on the data, this has been happening since the 70s. And my question back to the industry is, why is nobody looking at this? Why is Ben and Randy, we're the only people looking at this? It's because our industry is not stimulated or interested in we want to solve problems. I don't want to take away from the fact that we do have problems that need to be solved, but that can't be the only way we tend to define ourselves. I worked with nonprofits and foundations quite a bit, and I look at foundation giving. And if all you do is give to problems, then the community is just one big problem. Right? You got copy and paste language for your problems. Tell me about what's going right. What about all these people who are moving in and have been moving in since the 70s? So really, we live in the middle of everywhere. I'm going to just turn this language on its head. You put your home in one place, you work in another, you live and work, shop and play in this huge playground of the region of your rural communities. But how do you make a decision that reflects, how do you, decision makers, right? Positional leaders at the county level, how do you make decisions when that's not at the county level, when that's not how people live or work or shop or play? So now how you treat your region matters too. So for example, if I'm going to move to Hancock and I run into Molly on the street, she's the mayor, and she's like, "Oh, you're gonna love Hancock." I was like, "Yeah, I was looking at moving with my family here." And you're always like, "Hey, Hancock's great. We got Buddy's Bar and Grill. We have a full K-12 school. We have a C-store / car sales / deli / hair cutter on the corner." Right? I was like, "Oh, it is great. I love Hancock." But I'm also looking to move into Starbucks, which is like 18 miles down the road. And then Molly's like, "Oh, you don't want to move to Starbucks. They got nothing going on there. Hancock is where it's at." What did you just do? Not only did you downplay your neighbor, but you downplayed yourself, because you really do live in the middle of nowhere. If you can't name off things around you that people actually might enjoy to do, you are never going to be able to recruit them in. We'll talk about that in the next webinar too. So stepping back, this article was from 2009. The date's right here, right next to me. I can't point the right way on this, over my shoulder. It's 2009. I keep it in here for a reason. The Pew Research Institute, they do opinion studies. And for this one in 2009, they went out to Americans and they said, "All right, Americans, I know that 80% of you live in the city and 20% of you live in the country. But if you could live wherever you wanted, where would you live?" 51% of Americans said they prefer to live in small towns and rural places. Why don't they? I argue that the narrative is so negative, they think they never could. Right off the bat, the narrative is inhibitive of opportunity. And then you hear things like, "Wow, no, I don't like to hang out in the post office." like we're not hanging out in the post office. So anyway, how do you fight this negative narrative when it's out there? So there really is a national societal preference to live in small towns and rural places, less dense environments. People are moving to small towns and have been since the 70s. Not everybody's flocking to the cities, and a new urbanity a lot of times is found across our rural landscape too. So the number one audience for your negative narrative are your kids. These are my kids. If all your kids hear is that there is nothing here for you, your best days are behind us, you need to get out to be successful, they will never want to return. My point is, you need to let them know that they have a place to return to when they leave. So start a conversation about the future of your small town. So I'm going to end on this. So we got one data point here, and this is going to drive into the next presentation, which is in our newcomer surveys, we asked respondents, like, do you believe the community you moved to was welcoming? And a full 78% of Minnesotans said it was welcoming. But when we broke it down by another question, which is, are you likely to live here in 5 years? Which we're not going to follow up. But asking someone like, are you going to be here in 5 years, is kind of indicative of how it's going today, right? If it's not going well today, they'll be like, I'm not going to be here. This place is terrible, or whatever, right? But meanwhile, so now let's look at that delineation here. So for the people who said the community is welcoming, 86% said they'd be here in 5 years. Like, oh yeah, I'll be here in 5 years. But now, if the community is not welcoming, you've got a retention issue. Right? Just under half of people now will be here in 5 years. Are your employers ready to retrain everybody in town, their employees in the labor force, solely because your community is terrible at welcoming or including people in community life? This is the price we're going to pay, because in a tight labor market, labor's got power, folks. They got multiple communities to choose from. What differentiates one town from another is everything but the job at this point. So I'm going to talk about resident recruitment in 2 weeks. It's a whole model we kind of built that parallels industrial recruitment, right? Industrial recruitment as an economic development strategy is when we bring in the industry, and that is the reason why people move into our town, is because they will get a job in our town. Okay, that is a strategy from about 100 years ago that we're still employing today as a primary strategy across our landscape. I would argue if it's our only strategy, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. So we'll see in 2 weeks on that. But with that, I'm just going to say people are making a choice to move into our rural communities. They're creating groups, they're diversifying their economy, buying and starting businesses, living in a region. They're more than warm bodies. And the bottom line is people want to live and move to your towns for what you are today and will be tomorrow, not what may have been. In all the interviews and focus groups I've done, nobody ever said they're moving to your town for pity. Oh, Hancock, I feel so bad you lost your grocery store 27 years ago. I'm going to move in to help you out. Like, nobody ever says that. It's ridiculous. So people, you have to hear talk to newcomers in your communities. So you'll see a handout here. We've got a template where we want to invite you to do interviews with 2 newcomers, not just kids that you recognize, but people you may not recognize. We've got kind of a template about how to talk to a newcomer. You can find them. Your city clerks know who they are. Your property managers know who newcomers are. Your large employers know who newcomers are. So if you've got a chance, I just want to say, talk to a newcomer, because I think you're going to hear things about your community you may never have heard in the past. Oh yeah, so here's this newcomer interview. We'll get this sent out afterward, like just asking people, when did you move here? Did you live here before? And then what were push and pull factors related to that move? So we will be sharing a copy of this PowerPoint as well. A recording will be made available. We will invite you to take an evaluation after this too. But for now, Norm, I'll kick it back to you here. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thanks very much, Ben. We did have one question in the chat box. Ashley Deal asked, would you give your opinion of the kind of the trend with Dollar General and Casey's and Subways and so forth? What they're moving to smaller towns, and what kind of impact does that have, and what sort of things, how do you deal with it?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to the big box retailers, the impacts of the big box retailers from 25 years ago, 20 years ago, when ultimately we called them category killers, right? Big box retailers move into a town, and then there's certain retail categories in that town that you just cannot succeed in anymore. But there's other industries, auxiliary industries, that actually can succeed from that relationship. But then as you progress out from the town, you have a strong influence on the decline of the retail sectors immediately around. But the further out, then you get into things. Now we get dollar stores. They are the same category killers. In terms of retail categories, they're a single business that ultimately will kill off certain retail categories from being available in your community. I don't know what to say about it. I think we've got more control than people think sometimes in how we do things, but I don't really have a good answer for that. It's generally been the trend related to big box retailers, and I look at the influences of those, and really the ramifications are how can you build either auxiliary businesses around it, which is more for the big box retailers, but now it is. I mean, honestly, folks, I was real hopeful. We had seen wages rise, the labor power going up, wages were rising up until the pandemic, basically. We were seeing a reduced influence of, the housing related costs, housing burdened households, which are if you pay more than 30% of your income toward your housing and related costs, you're considered burdened. We're actually making a lot of progress on that. I think the trends for Dollar General were heavy when we started to see all these pushes upon our fixed dollars of income that we've got. But, for 3 to 5 years, you all know in our rural communities, we've had a labor shortage. Not now. Urban areas have just seen this in the past 5 years. We had this labor shortage for 15 years. And why is that? It's because of our housing. I'll talk about that in the third webinar. But ultimately, we're pretty stopped up in terms of just welcoming everybody in at this point. So that's kind of I don't do a lot of research on that. I just look at how we kind of end up having to kill off certain categories in the retail sector when they come in. So I know you've got groups. Oh yeah, IRA did a study too on Swain. I think great that somebody put in here about Dollar General too. So thank you.
I think we see periodically concern primarily with some of the grocery stores or the Dollar Generals or whoever, that there's not fresh produce and so forth. So the healthy food is sort of absent in smaller communities. And there has been a fair amount of work by the Institute for Rural Affairs and Sean Park in terms of trying to supplement those markets with community supported enterprises and these kinds of activities. So I think this is clearly there are some communities that are trying to get on top of it. This has been a great presentation. We're just a few more minutes. If somebody has a chat box or wants to put something in a chat box, we can try to pick it up.
And I'll jump in right here. Just to note, we're going to launch a quick poll, just a short single question poll for your quick reactions as you consider your next. We've got time for another question or so. We want to be mindful of everybody's time and the time of our presenters.
One of the questions I was interested in was where do these newcomers work? We have a fair amount of people that are actually coming in that supposedly without jobs locally, but what kind of jobs do they hold if they're not telecommuting, for example? Can you speak to that at all? What does the workforce look like or the area?
Yeah, I mean, it's all over the place. They've got all sorts of jobs they would have never been able to have 30 years ago, essentially. So number one, people commute all the time, even in greater distances even, but they don't have to commute as often as they used to in the past because of some work, life work balance things. So these, we literally saw every occupation and every industry listed in our newcomer surveys that were returned. We do know that there's a lot of pressure locally because the housing is the crux here. So if you've got an employer in town who can't, get employees to work there at their employment office because there's nowhere for them to live, then people moving in, telecommuting, are competing over these spots. So there's a big issue of attention over housing, but ultimately the telecommuting thing, they could be telecommuting. We saw that. I mean, there's been a well-worn rise in 1099 employment and self-employment in this country. So right now, those have been the bigger pictures. I think on the big one on the ag side was that we noticed was historically when we did the survey 20 years ago, when we asked people to list their occupation, if they were in ag or whatever, they would just list farmer. I'm a farmer. Today, it was like 85% of all the people who had farming as an occupation. Now, not only didn't they list it, they listed it as a secondary because they had a primary job before that. So, we do know that 70% of farmer owner operators make a majority of their income from off-farm sources. So my argument is like, man, I don't know that these people would have been farmers 20 years ago if we didn't have the diverse local economy. So instead of as ag goes, Main Street goes, it's as Main Street goes, ag goes, because we would have lost a number of farmers in our rural communities if we did not have a more diverse economy in the first place. So I think we tend not to see that. Like, when I lived in Hancock, I would drive from Hancock to Morris. Hancock to Morris is like corn and soybeans. And it's easy to think that agriculture drives the economy. But in truth, less than 5% of rural people today are engaged in ag or an ag-related field. 95% are not in that field, but the top industries today in rural America are education and health services. They make a third of all the jobs today, caring for people. Manufacturing 15%, ag 5 to 7%, right in there. So it just looks different too. And I think it's interesting just to look at how do people talk about your own community, about what you are? Like I've got county commissioners that talk different than city council people about who they are. County commissioners, we're an ag county. Local city people, like we're an urban area. You can have counter narratives in the same exact place. So not right or wrong. I'm just saying this narrative ultimately translates into actions dependent upon that. If your narrative is that you're dying, you're going to have a set of strategies around your dying narrative. But at the same time, why would anybody want to buy your dying businesses? Oh, we got 3 businesses for sale. Yeah, but aren't you dying? Like, why would anybody want to come in to buy your dying homes, your dying businesses, anything in your dying town? It's not true. You're still here. You're durable and desirable. Norm.
Thanks, Ben. This has been a great presentation. I really appreciate it. And I see we've kept about 120 participants for most of it, so this is terrific. Our next webinar is January 31st on rural resident recruiting. Ben will be doing it, and so we're hoping that you can talk to a few people in your community, to newcomers, and come back to us with some information there. And then we'll look forward to seeing you in a couple minutes or a couple of weeks. Mike, did you want to close out?
Yeah, I'd like to just say on behalf of the University of Illinois Extension, as well as rural partners, the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs and the Governor's Rural Affairs Council, thanks so much to Ben for this very informative presentation today, and to you, Dr. Walser, for your assistance with this webinar series. It's been mentioned a couple times, but you'll be receiving presentation materials and a link to the recording in the follow-up email. Again, reiterating what Dr. Walser said, we'd invite you to visit our website for registration for a number of future webinars. The website is go.illinois.edu/LGE. Next 2 webinars in the Attracting Rural Residents series will run on January 31st and February 14th, respectively at noon. I also want to put in a plug for one coming up later this week on January 20th. Local Government Education Series is offering a presentation covering state legislative updates for 2023. And remember, you can always use that same extension resource to find recordings on a host of our prior presentations on a wide variety of topics. So with that, I say thank you to all for attending today's webinar. Have a great day, and we hope to see you back for future presentations. Thanks so much.